want to tell you, please don't be polite. Feel free to speak your mind. We're talking about something that I think is still an open wound. You are associated with two media incidents, quite significant ones. One was the sign, the picture of Rabin wearing an SS uniform that you received, and the Kach movement day camp. And if you looking back at the role of the media and the activity of the media at the time, and you ask yourself if you would have done something differently, if the media acted correctly, well, that's quite a question, a very difficult question. Thank you. We want to try to break it down into several different levels. From the perspective of 30 years later, realizing that Avishai was the champagne of the Shabak, obviously I feel that something was wrong. I certainly do. Take responsibility. At the time, the only channel that existed, which was the first channel one, I think that the process that I think we can count on the fingers of one hand the number of journalists that presented some type of defense for Oslo and the Bon Ton that was leading the media at the time. Remember that in September 1993, the media was very different than it is now. There was only Channel 1 that I had the privilege of working for. I worked for that channel for almost 20 years. The Dr. Diker, president of your association, was the presenter for the English news channel. And I was a presenter for Channel 1. There weren't any alternatives. There wasn't Yisrael Hayom. There was just Yediot Achronot. There was an internet, so there wasn't any alternative or anyone to criticize, to be critical. So yes, the media, to a great extent, and Oslo is not only a major event, it is a defining event that impacted all of Israeli society. And yes, there certainly was a collective approach, and I certainly do take responsibility on behalf of myself, on behalf of my colleagues. I can count the people involved on the fingers of one hand. There were two Nadav Shagar and Nadav Ha'etzny. In Haaretz newspaper, there was Ev Shif that presented different data, the legendary military correspondent. There was Odidia Ari who presented an alternative, but he was always at 9:20 later on in order to prevent undermining the narrative of the media. So yes, as the Settlement correspondent, if of the 3,000, I checked before I came, if I could take this over 3,000 articles and videos that I did about Oslo at the time until the elections in 1996, if I could delete dozens of them, including the one that you mentioned about the Kach movement, and one of its stars was Avishai Aviv, and the other star was our current minister of internal security. I would certainly be glad to delete that from the protocol. And articles like that glorified small parts of the extreme right. Are you saying that they did not reflect the situation? Yes, obviously it wasn't a reflection. It was a small and extreme group that lived in very specific parts of Kiryat Arba, and with another small branch in Jerusalem. And the media covered that group and overreactive to a very extreme extent. Soon we'll hear what Danni Zaken has to say about that. But as a television correspondent, I covered it as if it was the Judea-Samaria Council. Just a quick question: would the Oslo Accord be what it was without the Israeli media? Just a quick answer. I think that if the media and groups like the IDSF and others, in 1993, the media in Israel was not what it is today, Nave. It was a completely different world. I'm not sure that everyone will agree that it's completely different. There wasn't media plural. There wasn't pluralism in the media at all. There was no chance. The Oslo Accords in 2023 would never have happened. They would never reach the point of an agreement signed at the White House. It's as simple as that. And why do I say that with so much confidence? Because at the time, everything was confidential. Everything was covert. I'm not arguing with you, but I certainly salute you and your security intelligence. But I think I understand more than you do about the media and about journalism. The situation in which Peres and his people hid the talks from Rabin, they were able to do so only because there wasn't an active media. Can you imagine a situation today, a world of social media, and I won't say Channel 14's. If there is no journalist pluralism, I'm restraining myself. At the time, there wasn't diverse journalism, and the editing committee at the time was an entity that received reports from the leaders of the government. There isn't today, that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as an functioning editing committee. The discourse in the media has completely changed. So in 2023, the Oslo Accords, as they came to the world in September 1993, the media would not have allowed it to happen. We're young people. We were in the army at the time, the army that you covered. There were journalists at the time, you, Danni, and others. Did the editors stop you? Did they block you? They allowed us. They said, okay, they would check off the box and enable other alternatives. I did dozens, hundreds, thousands of articles at the time, and if the Judah Samaria Council hadn't done all that exhibitionist thing, we hadn't been exposure on the only channel that existed at the time. There was data. It was at the fringes of the news report. Sometimes there were comments from Dory Gold. You can check on Google and you'll see that every so often they would allow someone with an alternative opinion to broadcast. There were other opinions that were presented, but the narrative, the bon ton, it existed, but it was at the margins, at the fringes. You get 20 full minutes of how Oslo would change the Middle East, and then at 9:20 you get a minute and a half of a different opinion. And you do. I want to read something that was said by Yigal Carmon at the time, who was president of the Memory Organization, and he said that there are other things that are coming up from Arafat's speeches, and his response was that is not true. Everything has to be analyzed based on what it serves. I want to comment. You mentioned Arafat's speech, so I want to comment. I'll explain. I was personally involved in that. At the time, I worked for on the radio channel too. We're talking about the famous speech in South Africa. Everyone covered it from where we were, with the emphases and the talk about the agreement with. It was. I apologize because I'm old. I don't remember the details, but it was. In the process, I worked for the ETEAM agency around 93. Right after Oslo, really as things were happening, really shortly after the signing ceremony at the White House. The speech was broadcast. I don't remember which organization, but one of the organizations that monitored Arafat's speech, I think it was called the Hudaiva speech, and we covered the speech. Micha covered it in Radio Channel 2. It wasn't hidden, but it was broadcast, and that was it. There was no discussion. There was no follow-up. It wasn't highlighted anywhere, even though it was an issue. And you asked again about the editors. There was a lot going on. A few months later, I was working for Kol Israel, Voice of Israel, and a unit from the Fatah organization did terror attacks in the Nablus area, and the IDF prosecutors wrote that this was a terror attack by Fatah terrorists, and these were the same people that had just exchanged olive branches with us. And again, it was mentioned on the news, not at 9:20, as he said. In our case, it was, it wasn't at prime time. It was mentioned, but there were no developments. There were no follow-ups. If something is reported in the morning, then it's covered later on in the day in the nighttime news report. I think that the general narrative was don't prevent us from making progress, and that was the media narrative as well. But I won't take responsibility only for the media. I also want to talk about the IDF. Effie was one of the only people at the IDF who did not support the Oslo Accords. The vast majority of people in the IDF supported the Accords, except for the General Chief of Staff. If you had a General Chief of Staff who objected to the Minister of Defense, there was Harpaz and other cases, that was something that could give me work for years. Today, you're completely independent. You work with people from the Shabak, from the army. You're completely independent. I have other limitations between what the right of the public to know and national security. Do I deal with issues of competence? To what extent the military competence has been damaged over the last few months. There's a discussion about whether the General Chief of Staff has to give a speech about this situation. I don't think that the details have to be released. I don't think that Hezbollah has to be given a full description of which military systems have been damaged. I don't think so, not at all. What Barnea wrote, everyone has its own agenda. And Yediot Achronot, it's a supermarket. You can find Nachum Barnea on the one hand and Nave on the other. There's Yossi and there's others. There are two of the the very veteran journalists, and you're talking. Research supports them as well. And one of the more interesting studies that were done in this field show that Yediot Achronot, after Haaretz, Yediot Achronot by definition was the most left-wing newspaper, more than Channel 1 and other radio stations. And I accept that study, but I think that if there were strong enough stories and enough clashes, I think that it would have been reflected. Where Ariel Kahana worked, and correct me if I'm mistaken, there was an article about Arafat smuggling in terrorists in the trunk of his car. It was a good story. I was a soldier during Oslo. I take this opportunity to say hello to all the people in the audience that I know. I was a soldier at the time in 1993, and I don't think that there was a single guarding session that I was alert, because I always had a transistor radio with me, and I would listen to the news reports, and the news reports were one big celebration that continues till today. In the mainstream media, you hear the same tune, a very clear, very central, with a very clear agenda. I think it continues until today. It's true that today there are other media channels that present they take a different stance. At the time, I didn't know where the future would take me while I was still a soldier. But a few years later, I was working on the radio, the Channel 7 ship at the time, for those of you who remember. And it always bothered me. As a soldier, I would listen to Channel 7, and I found them very annoying. And why? Because they were right. They were the only journalists who challenged the process, who asked questions, who brought the story about the recording of Arafat's speech. They were the first to talk about how Arafat is smuggling wanted people out of Gaza. And I'm sure that every military correspondent at the time was aware of the story but didn't want to broadcast it because of the agenda. And Channel 7 that I belonged to at the time, after a while, they were doing their job. There's an argument, we can call it a philosophical argument in the media, of whether its role is to cover the events or to criticize the events. And in the case of the Oslo Accords, the media didn't criticize and didn't report. It did neither. It certainly wasn't critical, but it didn't cover it correctly either. Very basic, fundamental questions weren't asked. And Channel 7 that I joined later on, I think that they did do their job. They did ask the questions. Unfortunately, we were right. And I feel that I had the privilege, that God gave me the privilege to work on a media channel that wasn't part of the mainstream, but it was something that searched for the truth. And I would conclude with two statements. One that was summarized by my editor at the time, Chagai Segal. He said, during those years in the media, you could be either a leftist or have no opinion. There was no alternative. And the final thing that I want to say to you, Nitzan, is that I want to congratulate you on your ability to take responsibility, to express your remorse. It's not something to be taken for granted.
Nitzan and Danni, let's go down to the practical side. Danni talked about it a little bit, but how does it work? You had one channel in Israel, you had one news reel, and someone comes in and has some information that is not part of the narrative. So who decides? The editor, the CEO, the director, who? We will now move on for 60 seconds to Media 101. How does the news work? This is the early 1990s. There was only one news program with 95% rating. And if I made a mistake in Hebrew, not a terrible mistake, but just a small grammar, then the call center would absolutely collapse, because how come you gave this idiot the option of broadcasting? So when you go into a situation where there are 200 events a day, from which you have to pick 20 or 25 to report on, because the average is 2 to 2.5 minutes per item, you can imagine, and every reporter wants to have their moment, and I can agree with Ariel, it's the same today, but who gets to the headlines? Who is the one that Chaim Yavin, the anchor, says at the beginning, and who gets presence and prominence? And I can, to talk poetically about right wing and left wing, and perhaps, Ariel, what you're saying is true. I can't say that for sure. But I can say with utter certainty, because I was there, is that the way that Oslo Accords were covered on Channel 1 at the time were part of this new Middle East atmosphere. And why do I think it's not only the media's sin, but a much bigger sin, much more than the Yom Kippur failure? Because if you read just last week the stenograms that were published about the Oslo cabinet meetings, you see that the chief of general staff at the time had everything, and they had their eyes closed. Not only Barak, the chief of general staff, but the media knew. So what you're saying is that in Yom Kippur there was a failure, and also there was one around Oslo? Yes, absolutely. Let me describe the situation to you. How the editor of the news program chooses the items. Because since I was the editor for 6, 7 or 8 years, I will tell you, they can come with their own habitat, of course. Of course, they don't live in this, world that has no opinions from before. But ultimately, if one correspondent brings an item and there's not enough stimulation, they don't... Where's Uri Ariel? Uri Ariel is one of the greatest. He would consider, together with Aaron Dom, we used to call him Dom Productions, because he would say, will it be broadcast on the news or not? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm on the radio. TV is superficial. In radio, we deepen. We don't look at the visual. We don't care about handcuffs or ships or all these things that Dom would bring us. We look for depth, and depth was missing, and it's because of the right wing and the objectors to this who did not bring enough material. And when I brought the material, it would be broadcast. But what was the problem? The problem was, how much room do you give it? And you broadcast something in the morning, some sort of item, and then when someone looks at the lineup and what is happening in the morning, it's also the editors of the programs afterwards. It could be Shali Yachimovic and other programs after the morning program, and they kind of resonate the items, and stories that did not follow the narrative were not resonated. What does it mean not to resonate? They chose not to resonate. I am covering, not criticizing. Okay, but we know how to do it. Again, if there's a story about Arafat smuggling people in the trunk of his car, and everyone follows up one another, then that's one thing. But otherwise, it's only told somewhere in the back. Look, you talked about Nadav Ha'etzni and Nadav Shragai. I remember on the radio in Kol Israel, I think it was Nadav Ha'etzni, on Sundays at 7 p.m. He used to give a news program on the radio, the only program that had some criticism to it, and it criticized the Oslo Accords. Now, if Nadav Ha'etzni, I think in some of the shows he also had a left-wing person sitting with him. But let's say Nadav Ha'etzni was on at 7 a.m. and not at 7 p.m. Of course, he would have been heard. It would have sounded differently. Okay, but Nadav is not that kind of journalist. The question is, Danny, has that changed? Is the Israeli media now different? Has it learned the lesson? Well, partially. Partially. First of all, there's a lot more media pluralism. We're not only talking about Channel 14 and Channel 7 that's still running, and many websites, by the way, ultra-Orthodox websites too, that give a more diversified snapshot. But the main media still has a narrative approach, and the best example is what's been happening the last 6 months, the whole matter of the protest and the way it's covered. And here they're also declaring publicly, Haaretz is saying that they're going against it systematically, and that's legitimate. If you say it, if you come out declaratively, but if you don't bring the stories that do not align the protest narrative, then you're already not doing your job as a journalist. And Haaretz, it's obvious. I think it's totally crazy, I don't get it. Maybe they think that how many hundreds of millions were there in the protests? That's what they say. So they think the same hundreds of millions will come and watch them. But I think that they are not doing their job as a journalist, and I don't understand it. But 12 is trying to be more balanced, and that's why it brings panelists like one from the right wing, and it's big panelists, usually the journalist, and one or two from the left. And there was this guy, what's his name? This whole panel. Danny, last time I went to the Channel 12 studio, it was 7 versus 1. Okay, so that's basically it. But let me just give you an example. You see things that are associated with the matter of the protest that are problematic, like the whole thing of refusing to go to your reserve duty, and I went against that, and I don't usually like to give my personal opinion, but I was attacked. And it's amazing to see. You see journalists, you see commentators who present this story as the sole blame of those who brought the judicial overhaul. They do not talk about the big danger of refusing to serve in the IDF as reservists. They call it volunteerism. So you're saying that the media Is the problem? No, it's just that it's not bringing the story as it is. It's not covering it properly, not giving proper commentary. What's going to happen later on? What's going to happen when the other side don't like it? And by the way, the other side continue to serve in the army. So Yossi, I see you're either, you're not accepting this, you didn't agree to this, but you know about the criticism about military correspondents, some of whom over the years have become spokespersons. I'm not supposed to represent spokespeople. I think that the military correspondents have changed over the years. I think that it is much more diverse. It's professional. They don't speak in the same voice. Danni talked about refusing to serve. From the first moment, I objected to this phenomenon. I also objected to generals who are personal friends of mine because they have retired from the army many years ago, and I sit with them and I consult with them, but I actually spoke against them in items on the news, and it's good, it's diverse, everyone speaks their opinion. Okay, but I give you the credit for it, but you are definitely alone. Apropos a supermarket with pluralism of media, now the consumer is intelligent. It knows who to listen to. They look for you. They don't look for a newspaper or a channel, TV channel. They look for you on Instagram, on Telegram, on Twitter. The person chooses their newspaper or their journalist. We're no longer there where you watch Channel 12 and you accept whatever they give you. No, you pick whatever correspondent and whatever journalist suits you, and that's why this is no longer the case. You get me on 5-6 different platforms, in the morning what I do, and then later in different places. And if we look at since Oslo and currently, they are right in terms of research and how things were covered. It was biased, but I do have a problem professionally understanding how, with such huge biases between Chief of General Staff and Prime Minister, and afterwards when Rabin overtakes him and goes to Shachak and does this exercise, I mean, come on, this is the kind of material that you can live off, that you get paid for, apropos the affairs we've had recently. So how is it not covered? You think these days it would have been a headline? I think so. Obviously, it's clear to me, and also in my study, Yediot Achronot is in second place in this respect, in terms of its bias. But if we then go to the disengagement, again, in the disengagement, it wasn't perfect. From a security perspective, I do think that it was insufficient, but there were warnings. If you take Bogi Elon's crazy dismissal, that was not covered. Bogi Elon was dismissed and Chalutz was brought. The Farm Forum just brought him in. Nowadays, we're somewhere else entirely. Is it perfect? No, not from this side, not from the other side. I don't like what I see here, and I don't like what I see there. But things changed dramatically. Now you have social media, and their rating is far better than any news show on TV. It doesn't matter what people say on the TV. A whole story can go on Twitter and make much larger waves, even though it wasn't on TV. Take the story about Ben Gvir and the prisoners. You don't need him to be at the 2 o'clock newsreel. I have no doubt that despite the changes, of course, social media and the pluralism of media outlets have changed things, but the bottom line is that the main media outlets, certainly Channel 12, Channel 11, Channel 13, and the main newspapers lead a certain line. Let's not play games. I don't want to talk about myself, I'm talking in general. There is a kind of agenda, every media outlet has an agenda, and not all consumers are so clever that they follow journalists. I don't think we journalists are so important. People pick channels, and a channel has an agenda, has a line, and the bias in Oslo was there then, and it is now. We still have it now, just like the protest is being covered, just like the election campaigns are being covered. And when I taught communications, I used to tell students, now in the past it was biased and now it's okay. And then in the elections of 2015, the media was completely on the side of the opposition against the government, and now it's really hit a peak in the last 6 months. It's no longer media coverage, it's just crazy. The bias and the numbers they're saying are protesting and so on. And when I go into Channel 12, I have a commentator sitting there. I think his name is Roy Neumann. In 1 minute he gives an insight on what's happening on the news, and the next minute he goes to the camera and he says, tonight on Kaplan. That's being media, that's North Korea. I tried to make a difference in Galei Tzahal in this, since he talked about the numbers. Now, I was taught in Kol Israel, listen, you can't take the number that the protesters give you. And at least in the first few months, that was the bon ton of most media outlets. If the protesters said 200,000, 200 says, it is on the headline. Now, I'll give you a story. The protesters use technology. They use drones. The main headquarters of the protest, some of the high-tech companies are on board. They take drones, and these drones measure and allegedly count the protesters in some high-tech technology. And one day the police decided to do the same thing. They took the same company, and the same company checked for both sides. Now let's say, what did the organizers of the protest say? What was the number that the police got? It was about 4 times as much. 30,000 versus 120,000. Now I told Galei Tzahal, we had a meeting, and we said we don't know what to do, so we made some changes. First of all, it's obvious that if you quote the protesters, you can say, according to the organizers, that's fine, that's legitimate. But you should do it yourself. Sometimes your eyes cannot see anymore, you can't count, so you try to ask the police, and their assessments also maybe are not accurate. And finally, we found a system, about dozens of thousands. Now, when I did that, suddenly everyone was at my throat. He says there are fewer protesters than there really are. Well, that's a good example. So I want to know, the government, before it takes a certain step, does it also try to examine how the media take it? And will the media support it or not? I mean, if now there's another step, any step taken by the government, the media will instantly support it. Let's say we have an agreement with Lebanon. Let's say there's an agreement in Lebanon where we give up certain territories. Would the media, would the government take into account whether or not the media will support it? Of course. What do you mean? Any government, any politician, the first question they ask is, how will the media cover it? That's obvious, I think. But I think this is the kind of answer you'd want to hear. Did the previous government think that it would be more supported by the government? First of all, by the media? First of all, yes. And it was also right. I have a story about that as well. At some point, when there was the agreement about the maritime border with Lebanon, I got a notice from one ministry or another that the entire line was given to Lebanon. They gave the Lebanese almost everything they wanted except one small strip that was defined a security zone, and within this concession there was also territorial waters. Not much, but some. EEZ. And then we had a meeting with Hulata, who was the head of the Security Council, and he presented it, and I asked time and again, this is the main story, this is going to be in the headlines. And I was a correspondent in Globes, and I gave it a headline in Globes, and that's the story, that we gave them the entire line in exchange for, okay, maybe it's right, maybe it's not right, but we conceded. And it was not resonated in any other media outlet, even though it was the biggest newspaper headline from that story, and nobody resonated it. Now, later on, it turned out that Some of those who negotiated the Lebanese, who were on the committee, who were in the deliberations, um, had resigned in protest. But this was not covered elsewhere. And you ask yourself, what, these correspondents don't know? I know that most correspondents knew the story. Some of them even got the same leaks and same information. But why? They didn't want to criticize this agreement. They didn't want to criticize the fact that it was not brought to the Knesset and it was not voted on. But if you think about it the other way around, they would have completely had their heads. So we'll go over to questions in just a moment, but I just want to give you some final remarks. But I do want to ask you, Nitzan and Ariel, about what it's like to be a journalist, a reporter who is a religious Zionist after the Rabin assassination.
In 30 seconds, I must say that after Rabin's assassination, I stopped wearing a kippah for a decade or two because I felt that it had been violated, that the kippah had been violated, and it took me about 10 years after my daughters grew up, got older, and my daughters told me to wear a kippah because I was embarrassing them at their school. And without getting into the political traps that exist today and the political parties that call themselves religious Zionists, I think that remember that Oslo was in 93 and the assassination was in 95, 2 years later. So I don't like to make a direct connection, to draw a direct line between the two, but I think that the media in 2023 is very different. I can't say that the problem with the media is what would have changed anything. We tend to say if there had been pluralism among journalists, if there weren't other if there had been other news channels at the time, the truth is that it wouldn't have made a difference. We can't just kill the missioner. All of the leaders, the security, the defense leaders, everyone wanted to give peace a chance, and the media was part of the festivities. We can't kill the messenger. The messenger reflects a reality, and I agree with what was said before, but I think that ultimately most of us, not including myself, for the past 33 years, I've been a journalist, and I still consider myself a journalist, even though Ariel calls me a clerk. I'm not embarrassed. Yes, you did. You said that once. You called me a senior clerk. At least I'm senior. That's something. At least at high level, that's something too. But going back, if you're comparing me to your father, then I consider that a compliment. At the end of the day, the Oslo Accords were a watershed, probably one of the most significant line that was crossed since the establishment of the State of Israel, and not what is happening. That is not the case for what has been happening here in the last 7 months. And I have to be very cautious because I don't want to get myself fired after this panel. The media was another layer in what happened, in the mistakes that were made at the time. We all were together shared the opinion that we had to give peace a chance. I once had a meeting with a minister from the Likud party. It was a first meeting with that politician, and the first thing that he said to me was, "Why don't you change your last name?" And I say that because no one has ever said to me, "Listen, the fact that your name is Kahana, that means you have extreme right opinions, so we won't hire you for Channel 2, Galei Tzahal, or other stations." But I do have the feeling that if I didn't carry that burden on my shoulders, and maybe the way I was raised and possibly my name as well, I think more doors would have opened for me over the course of my career. I never hid my opinions, and I felt that it was a privilege and even an obligation. I didn't mean to be a right-wing journalist. I just found myself in a situation where these things had to be said because there weren't enough people saying them, and I assume that closed doors to me later on in my career, but I don't regret, I have no regrets. I want to disagree with what Nitzan said about the influence of the media. And as proof, we can see that today, when the media, which is trusted a lot less now than it was at the time, the media was able to stop the legal reform. And if there had been critical media at that time, a similar thing would have happened. The situation that Barak described wouldn't have been as it was. We talked about the IDSF that were also part of the event. I know it's a complicated question, but I need a short answer. If I look back at the past 3 decades, the army is a very different place. I write a lot about the social aspects of the IDF, the combat soldiers. I met with courses. I met with participants in courses and commanders' courses, 50% from the religious Zionists. Many high-level IDF officers come from the settlements, but somehow all of the fire goes to the generals. So the army really has changed. And in 5 to 10 years from now, half of the headquarters will be different. In the Air Force, things are different. The pilots, among the pilots, there hasn't been that transition yet. We're on the midst of the largest social revolution in Israel's history. The Unit 820, the intelligence corps, has taken upon itself to bring technology to the peripheral areas and giving people in those areas opportunities. 30,000 students participate in these programs, and that will bring an enormous revolution. So you think that the pilot's course has to change as well? Does the DNA have to change? What has to be done in the pilot's course is to do what Unit 820 did. What did 820 do? 8200 do. It's not that those who pass the pilot's course has connections. All the people who are trained pilots deserve to pass the train, are very well trained and deserve to be pilots. But the question is where the pool comes from, the pool of candidates comes from. And Unit 8200 saw that within a column that everyone comes from Ra'anana, Kfar Saba, or Hod HaSharon. It's not good for the unit. And 8200 did something independently without asking anyone. It allocated resources and budgets to the peripheral cities and opened the Magshimim program. It's an excellent program, but it's a boutique program that covers small numbers and too late. But later on, the next process was going to the production floor at grade 7, grade 8. In that case, there are 30,000 students participating in the IDF A200 program. I don't need another 30,000 people in the intelligence corps, but we do have to increase the pool. It's giving these people an opportunity, making them part of the pool of candidates. And that has to be done in the Air Force as well. When there's a problem, as was done with women, there were people came and said, I want 10% women in the female candidates. And what they did, they took all of the female pilots and brought all of the female candidates and motivated them, and that's how they increased the pool. And the same thing has to be done in the peripheral areas of Israel. So we don't want to go too far away from the topic of this conference. If you want to talk about the changes in Galei Tzahal, the changes that are necessary in Galei Tzahal, we can do that at a different opportunity. But now just a few words in conclusion. I can't give a lot of details, but there definitely will be changes in Galei Tzahal. With regard, in summary, I think that the perspective of the question of whether it is still possible, not that the media stopped the reform, it supported the protest and gave it a voice and a platform. And I checked studies on news on radio programs in Israel. It covered Reshet Bet and Our Channel, and 40% of the people interviews in both of these programs were leaders of the protests. And that's also, you ask the difficult questions, but that's not necessarily the case. It really gives them a stage, gave them a platform. So the media definitely contributed, but the protests were the ones that that called the shots. The question that Yossi is talking about pluralism, and I must acclaim him for the way he presents the IDF and the social developments and the changes in 8200 in the pilot's course. They refused to make that change, by the way. That is what has to be done in the media. It is being done only partially to a certain extent, but not enough yet and not everywhere. But it has to be part of the DNA of the journalists. I am not here because I'm a right-wing journalist. No one knows what my opinions are. No one knows. People think that they know, but even my wife doesn't know who I vote for. I try to represent professional journalism that tells that woman from Sderot that we called Mas'uda at the time, and the resident of Kfar Saba and Kahana. Everyone's voice should be reflected in the media and should be represented. Questions should be asked. Allow them to ask the questions of the policymakers, politicians, and leaders, and that doesn't exist enough right now. I want to say something in that context. On the right wing and the right wing, it's already clear. But I already say that you have to join all of the media channels. Don't stay in your own bubble. One of the reasons that we have these social rifts that we're facing right now is because everyone is in their bubble. I tell people, read all of the media channels. Challenge yourself. Read what you like and read what you don't like. It's true not only for the public, but also for the decision makers, for the policy makers. What you said about the army made me a little bit optimistic. But it applies to the people who have money, who are try to use their capital to influence public opinion. Be open-minded. Give everyone an opportunity to express themselves. In a word, you can talk nostalgically about the professional journalism of the past. You said that your wife and my wife, they don't know who we vote for, but I think that we're closing our eyes because today the media has obscured the boundaries. There are no boundaries between public opinion leaders and journalists. It's all mixed together. So in the case of the Oslo Accords and today, the number of journalists, and I want to compliment you, like people like Yossi Yehoshua, who deserves compliments even though you disagree with me. How many people are actual journalists and not talents, people who are agents that maximize their monetary capabilities? Today and 30 years ago is all the same. How many journalists who would receive data from the IDSF about peace and war, how many of them will go into the details, spend 5-6 months researching it in order to present an in-depth article on it? The difference between 1993 and 2023 is maybe 10 journalists. With all of the diversity in Israeli society and in the media, I can try to imagine how many programs like Uvda and Makor on TV, and how much Lipskin, or in Haaretz, I forgot his name, Gidi Weitz, how many journalists like that are? There's maybe a handful, maybe 10. So, if you want to be nostalgic about what happened then, I'm still scared that when it comes to this next security defense challenge, we'll still see the same negative results as those that we saw in 93. Thank you very much. I'm not going to end the panel yet. I see that there are questions, but I promised Effie beforehand. I'm sorry, he has connections. Is it by... Is based on where he sits or what his military rank is. When I spoke before, she said that he's known because of the report that Yosef said, "Get out, תצא בחוץ, get out." That's his claim to fame. And I want to make a comment and ask a question very briefly. You talked about the diversity of the media channels, how the journalism has changed. There's so many more journalists, different directions, different platforms, etc. That's a quantitative perspective. But I want to talk about the qualitative perspective. Is the media still capable of reflecting concepts such as nationalism, Jerusalem, the flag, the IDF, not only as a subject of investigations in cases of problems and failures, but as part of the value of the Jewish society, as an element that is willing to sacrifice itself for national security, for national defense. Are you willing, the question is, are you willing to reflect not only Mas'uda in Sderot, but the spirit of the state of Israel? Are you capable, or do you want to, or do you think that it is legitimate to reflect values of that kind, or does that touch on fascism or anti-liberalism that is considered illegitimate in the mainstream media? And that is the question, in my opinion. I'll begin because I'm head of a media channel, and I think I have the privilege to make decisions of this kind. The answer is absolutely yes. I am leading a process in Galei Tzahal to move the Galei Tzahal to Jerusalem. This week, some of the programs are moving, and if I receive a permanent assignment, then I also plan to move the majority of Galei Tzahal to Jerusalem in a longer-term process, because I think that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and I think that a leading media channel in Israel has to broadcast from there. It's also the center, the hub of the political and diplomatic news, and I said that in the journalist course, there are a lot of obstacles, but it will happen in the end. And the general story of IDF and values, I certainly do try to relay. It's much more complicated within the system. When you interview someone who supports not serving, stopping to serve in the army, it's very difficult. It's more difficult to talk about the values. The practical aspects, I think that honestly the answer is no, and I'll explain why. There is no audience for that, and the media today works based on clickbites. You have to make a living, and it's all about the ratings. If someone thinks differently, you may think differently. These are the type of items that people don't consume. People aren't interested in that. And you ruined it. You ruined Danni's answer. As a person whose opinions are more nationalist, I wish it was what you were saying, but it would be that way. But I think that contradicts the journalist values, because I really don't want to be North Korea and present the opinion of the leader and of the state. I think I haven't developed a language. I can speak on behalf of the people. I'm a person. I'm an individual person. What type of items are you talking about? So my answer today is that I can't create a language of this kind, and I don't completely agree with Yossi, because I think that items like that are read when you write an article about a hero, an officer who was heroic, things like that. If the emphasis, there are emphases that can be slightly modified or slightly improved if you want the values, you want national values. But from there to the high words that you were talking about, I don't know how to combine nationalism and professional journalism. Do you have anything to add, or do you want to move on to the next question?
if at the time there was Channel 14 or one of the radio stations and a right-wing newspaper, Rabin would not have been able to disrespect Barak and say it is the leader's decision despite your criticism. There was no criticism. Even if there was, people were scared of saying it. Eitan, you were probably late, so you didn't hear what I said. I said exactly what you said, that the media diversity was one of the greatest changes and the greatest differences, and back then there was only one channel. Now there's a media diversity, media pluralism, and so all the secrecy. May I remind you how they began in terms of the media? It was all in secret. It was even kept from the Prime Minister, right? Yitzhak Rabin of blessed memory. So of course, if there was a channel, they wouldn't mention the name of the channel, but if there was such a channel or more diversity, of course. The coverage would have been differently, but the fact that we now have social media, the fact that we have many people who attack. In fact, one of the lessons I learned from the Oslo Accords, and perhaps I'm now shooting myself in the leg because now I'm head of the government press bureau, but Oslo Accords has made me doubt what's official. I keep asking, what's the agenda? What's the interest behind it? Taking a narrative that was embedded in various dark corridors, I think it was in Oslo itself, and keep asking what was the interest behind the person publishing and issuing this information, and not to just say this is it, this is the truth. Anyone else want to add something? You wanted to ask a question? Let me just say one thing. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. To a certain extent, they were accepted sourly by the media, also in books later published and in attempts, or they didn't actually go into the main story, which is the huge geostrategic change that Israel has done, and the next step is Saudi Arabia.
How was the influence of the international pressure? I have the honor to speak afterwards in a panel, so I won't go on this. But about the internet, how did you feel it? I mean, why is not present in your thought? You know that international pressure was like a tank on you at that time, or am I wrong?
I think that you are absolutely right. The international press in Israel and around the world plays a key role. Kissinger talked about Israel not having a foreign policy. Everything is just an internal policy, domestic policy. And in this context, I think that his statement is not true. Because now, the leaders of Israel, the heads of the state, of course they care about their base, and of course they care about what Yediot and Ma'ariv say about them. But most of the leaders around the world begin their morning after they pray Shacharit, and they talk and they read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and also in the Oslo Accords, the international press played a very, very important role. I remember the reports on who will get the Nobel Prize ceremony. Will it actually be Peres, Rabin and Arafat, or shall we only take Yossi Beilin and the thing they talked about Abu Allah? And ultimately, the foreign press played a very important role, including in Oslo itself, with Rabbi Malkiel, you probably know this story, who was then the chief rabbi, to take it up to the leader level so that Rabin will continue and be committed to the Oslo Accords, because if he gets a Nobel Peace Prize, then there'll be continuity later on as well. So I certainly do agree with you, and we'll be the last ones to disrespect the great importance of international press. Ariel Kahana, Yossi Yehoshua, Nitzan Chen and Danni Zaken, thank you all very much.